This is ntgreek.net, Course 1, Lesson 7. Today we're going to look at relative pronouns. Say what? These are things that are actually very familiar to us, but we may not realize what we ought to be calling them. But relative pronouns are words like what, which. The words who, which, and what are relative pronouns when they are used to introduce a relative clause. Consider the following sentence. The man who lives next to me has a goat. The simple sentence consists of the main clause, the man has a goat. We have that highlighted in bold. But there's a relative clause specifying which man, and we have that highlighted in yellow. That's the phrase, who lives next to me. The relative pronoun is who. Its antecedent is man. The relative pronoun who relates the information in the relative clause to the man in the main clause. That's why it's called a relative pronoun and a relative clause. It relates the information in the relative clause to the man in the main clause. Here are the relative pronouns in Greek. You'll see that we have masculine forms and feminine forms and neuter forms. For each gender, we have singular and plural forms, and of course these forms are declined for case, nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. The declension is very regular. The masculine relative pronouns follow the second declension pattern without exception. Even the nominative singular retains the sigma that is lost when we decline the definite article. The feminine relative pronoun follows the first declension without exception. Only in the neuter do we encounter what might be considered an anomaly, and that is the missing nu in the nominative and accusative singular. There are rough breathings throughout the declension of the relative pronoun. Every relative pronoun form has a rough breathing mark. That's going to help you distinguish between the nominative forms of the relative pronouns and the definite article, particularly in the masculine and feminine genders. All forms are accented. So let's contrast the relative pronoun with the definite article. The masculine nominative singular relative pronoun retains the sigma. You'll remember that the definite article is simply ha without a sigma. The masculine and feminine nominatives are accented. You'll remember that the definite article looks just like these forms, with the exception that the nominative singular does not have a sigma in the definite article, and the definite articles are not accented in the nominative singular and plural for the masculine and feminine forms. T is, or tau in Greek, T in English, is nowhere added. You'll remember that in the definite article, once we get out of the nominative case, the definite article always begins with a tau. And in the neuter gender, even in the nominative case, the definite article begins with a tau. But the relative pronoun never begins with a tau. So here you see below in the white background the definite article, and above in the yellow background you see the relative pronoun. Very similar, but with distinct differences. And because the relative pronoun is so regularly declined, if you simply remember the first and second declension endings as we have learned them, and then remember to put a rough breathing mark and an accent over the vowel, then you're going to be able to construct the declension for the relative pronouns. Looking at the contrast between the relative pronouns and the definite article, just to review what we've already said, you'll notice that the relative pronoun retains the sigma, the definite article does not have it. The relative pronoun has a rough breathing mark and also an accent mark in the nominative, singular, and plural forms for the masculine and feminine gender. The definite article has only the rough breathing mark, no accent. The definite article has tau at the beginning of the word in all instances except for the masculine and feminine nominative forms. There are no taus in the relative pronouns. As is the case with other pronouns, a relative pronoun usually agrees with its antecedent in gender and number. So we have the expression in Luke chapter 12 and verse 46, hora heu gnoske, an hour which he does not know. Here is our relative clause, which he does not know. And we translate that. The relative pronoun he, the eta with an iota subscript, agrees with its antecedent in gender and the number. It is feminine and it is singular, to agree with hora. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17, we have this, Timotheon has esten mu teknon, Timothy, who is my child. Has esten mu teknon is the relative clause. That means, who is my child. The relative pronoun has agrees with Timotheon in gender and number. It is masculine and it is singular because Timotheon is masculine and singular. In the exercises, you should be sure that your relative pronouns agree with their antecedents in gender and number. However, in the New Testament, you will find examples where this rule is not followed. Rather, in some instances, there is a construction according to sense. So we have in 2 John 1, eklekte kuria kaitois teknois autes hus ego agapo, to the elect lady and to the children of her whom I love. Our relative clause is hus ego agapo. In the English, that is, whom I love. We look at the word teknois, and we see that it is neuter and plural. That's the word for children. We look at the relative pronoun, which refers back to something in the preceding clause, and it is not neuter, it is masculine and plural. So we start looking for something that is masculine and we don't find it. The only other possible antecedent would be kuria, the lady. But kuria is feminine and singular. So what do we have here? Well, we have a relative pronoun that is not agreeing with its antecedent in gender. But if this relative pronoun is simply referring to the people, rather than paying attention to the fact that the word for the children is neuter, then the relative pronoun could be masculine. Or if the relative pronoun is referring to both the woman and the children, then the relative pronoun is masculine because we have a group of people, possibly some of masculine gender and some of feminine gender. So here you don't have grammatical agreement, but you do have what you might say is an agreement according to the sense of the sentence. While relative pronouns will typically agree with their antecedents in gender and number, case is another matter. Let's take the sentence, the man who lives next to me has a goat. The relative clause was who lives next to me. In its own clause, who functions as the subject. In other words, if you just take what's in yellow, who lives next to me, The verb is lives. What's the subject? Well, that would be who. Who is the subject of the verb lives? For this reason, who is in the nominative case. In English, if it were in the objective case, it would be whom. He is the man whom you saw. In this instance, we do have whom. The relative clause is whom you saw. In this example, whom is not the subject in its own clause. You is the subject of the verb saw. Whom is the direct object. Whom you saw. We could reorder that and say the same thing. You saw whom. So whom is the object of the verb. You saw whom. For this reason, the objective case, whom, is used in English rather than the nominative case, who. Well, we have a similar thing in Greek. The case of the relative pronoun is determined by its function in its own clause. Consider two of the examples we have already cited. Timothen, has estin mu teknu, Timothy, who is my child. In the relative clause, has estin mu teknon, the relative pronoun has is nominative because it functions as the subject in its own clause. It is the subject of the verb estin, who is my child. It need not agree in case with its antecedent Timothen. Timothen, accusative, but has, nominative, because in its own clause it is the subject. Eklekte kuria kaitois teknois autes hus ego agapo, to the elect lady and to the children of her whom I love. Hus ego agapo, whom I love, that is our relative clause. The relative pronoun whose is accusative because in its own clause it functions as the direct object of the verb agapo. I love whom. Love is the verb, I would be the subject, and whom is the object of the verb. So both in Greek and in English, we have this relative pronoun in an objective case. In Greek, specifically, it is in the accusative case. The case of the relative pronoun is determined by its function in its own clause. I'm going to drive that point home here because the very next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you there's an exception to this, and it's an exception that occurs frequently. Often, the case of the relative pronoun will be attracted to the case of its antecedent. So now we have just learned that the case of the relative pronoun is determined by its function in its own clause, and now I'm going to tell you that very often that's not the case. This is especially true when the function of the relative pronoun in its own clause would call for it to be accusative. That is, it would be the object of the verb in its own clause. And its antecedent is genitive or dative. When you have these circumstances, a genitive or dative antecedent, and a relative clause in which the relative pronoun would be the object of the verb, it is very typically the case that the case of the relative pronoun is attracted to the case of the antecedent. That is, it will become the same in case as the antecedent. In such cases, the relative pronoun will often conform to the case of the antecedent. Hora he ugnoske, an hour which he does not know. This is an example. Our relative clause, he ugnoske, which he does not know. He would be our subject, know is our verb, and which would be the object of knowing. We would say it would be the direct object. And so we would expect that which would be accusative, because it would be the direct object of the verb ginoske. But it is not accusative, it is dative. Why? Look at the antecedent. The antecedent, hora, is dative. So the relative pronoun, he, which means which, is agreeing with its antecedent, which is hora, our, in the dative case. In its own clause, he is the direct object. It's the thing that someone doesn't know. One would expect the accusative case. But here the relative pronoun is dative, having been attracted to the case of the antecedent, hora. So let's review. As a rule, a relative pronoun will agree with its antecedent in gender and number. There are exceptions to this rule. Look first for the case of the relative pronoun to be determined by its function in its own clause. But there are numerous exceptions to this rule.